From Kona to Yenan, the political memoirs of Koji Ariyoshi. Chapter 7, Return to Manzanar. During the month and a half of freedom in Idaho, Manzanar Relocation Center had undergone considerable transformation. When we returned to the barbed wire confinement in the summer of 1942, we found the detestable semi-desert land actually blossoming in spots. At twilight, the night checkers still made their rounds with pads in their hands to account for all occupants of the tar-papered barracks rooms. And as darkness fell, the powerful searchlights from the sentry towers probed over the camp like moving fingers. In this new community progressively becoming formalized, parents were worried by the tendency toward family disintegration. Children went their own way, since the family table and the privacy of the family circle, both of which knit a family together, were taken from the evacuees. The greatest change I observed in Manzanar was the settled atmosphere among the residents, with the great majority thinking they would be kept there for the duration of the war. There was a feeling of despondency, of brewing bitterness and frustration, and also a growing sentiment to struggle and fight for human decency and constitutional rights. Many evacuees felt that after the war we would be shipped to Japan, regardless of who won the war, because of the hysteria and anti-evacuee sentiment whipped up by special interest groups on the outside. There were others who were writing to their Caucasian friends and keeping democratic-minded groups on the outside informed as to conditions in camp, and telling them that they were fighting for freedom and civil rights from behind barbed wire. So the evacuees were thinking of their future, having more time for thoughts because they had become more accustomed to conditions in Manzanar. We were not wholly engaged in fighting the elements and in getting adjusted, as we were in the beginning. The dust storms still prevailed, but we fought them by planting grass and trees, which someday in the future would break the wind. 1 week after my return from Idaho, I learned what various Nisei leaders in camp were thinking. I was approached by a few of them to organize a group which would have as its program the fighting for civil rights and better camp conditions. These Nisei leaders represented diverse elements. They were left-wingers who had unequivocally opposed Japanese militarism prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, and whose outspoken stand had irritated and even embarrassed some of the other Nisei who now joined them in the civil rights struggle. They were leaders of the Japanese American Citizens League from the Los Angeles area, then sharply criticized by Manzanar evacuees for various reasons. The criticisms of the embittered people, such as those which blamed the JACL leaders for the evacuation, were in large part groundless. This was a difficult period for local chapter leaders of the JACL and relocation centers, and it is a credit to the organization that its national officers in Salt Lake City gave constructive leadership that eventually won the broad support of the Nisei. I was told by these Nisei leaders in Manzanar that I was a logical choice to organize such a group because of my recent record in helping the agricultural furlough workers in Idaho, which was well known and appreciated by residents of the camp. I called the first meeting at the centrally located Block 16 mess hall because it was well publicized by the Manzanar Free Press, and because many of the evacuees wanted to hear about our Idaho experiences. The building was packed long before meeting time, when it was overflowing. Many stood outside, and some brought boxes on which they stood to get a better view through the windows. About 600 or 700 were there. Shortly after the meeting was called to order, a World War I veteran took the floor to denounce the United States, which he bitterly criticized for throwing even a veteran like him into a concentration camp. He said the victory of the Japanese army was a victory for all of us. Once a Jap, always a Jap. Why organize a group to fight for civil rights? We were all in a concentration camp, citizens and aliens, all being treated alike, he said. Another World War I veteran, a super patriot who boasted confidentially that he was writing letters to the FBI, stood up and raved about Americanism in a 200%er fashion. Others stood up to give vent to their bitterness, and we all learned for the first time how individuals and groups of people felt toward the evacuation and life at Manzanar. There were expressions of frustration, anger, and hope. The meeting was a good sounding board. A few of us spoke on the need of organizing ourselves, in fighting for civil rights for the Nisei as well as for the Issei, to help improve conditions in camp, and plan and work toward relocation and resettlement in inland communities. There were Nisei who felt that the Caucasian administrators in camp should work closely with Nisei rather than always consulting Issei and letting them carry out policies. As the night war on the Manzanar Citizens Federation was born, another meeting followed 2 weeks later, and out of this preliminary work the organization set its roots into the community. Various blocks elected their delegates to establish the federation on a grassroots basis. The World War I veteran who had spoken so bitterly at the very first federation meeting failed to stop its organization. He next resorted to threats and with 2 henchmen came to me almost every day, warning me to disband the Federation, or else. Theirs was a fanaticism engendered by bitterness. There was a danger of their turning the bitterness of numerous other evacuees to anti-America sentiment. Many months later, after we had gone to Idaho to top sugar beets and some of us had volunteered for the army, and the Federation was long since defunct because its active leaders had left the camp, there was a riot on the first anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack. The sentiment that had developed among a sizable number of evacuees was not pro-Japanese militarist, but predominantly anti-America, caused by bitterness and bungling by the camp administration. A striking example of bungling and bullying by the director and his assistant was the strike forced on the camouflage net factory workers, who were producing far above the quota and who had been cited by Army authorities for efficiency. I was then working, in the summer of 1942, in the camouflage net factory. We had an incentive system. Every gang produced its quota, which was jacked up a few times, and went home fairly early in the afternoon. We were paid $16 a month. When word came to Manzanar that the Army Engineer Corps inspector was coming to our camp to see the net project, the camp director and his assistant decided to keep the factory workers in the plant all day long. They anticipated that the inspector might come late in the afternoon and find the factory empty. When news got around that the directors were going back on their word on the quota system, all workers began talking of striking. Early in the morning of the day the director was going to announce the all-day work rule, I went to his office for the second time to discuss the matter. I told him that members of the Federation had asked me to discourage the administration from instituting the policy, which was intended merely to put on a good show. The assistant director, who boasted that he could out-talk anyone in camp, told me that we must show our loyalty and that hostile Americans were watching our conduct from the outside. I told him his job was to help us, not bully us. What can we say when the inspector sees the idle factory? He asked me. He knows we produce above quota. That's not good enough for him when he sees the racks idle part of the day. The government won't bring in other projects, he argued. And the assistant director had a loudspeaker system rigged up between net factory buildings and announced the all-day work policy. The workers who listened to him were deathly silent, and the stop work demonstration was on. Eventually, most of the workers returned to the factory and continued on the old quota basis, ignoring the administration's new policy order, after a stop work demonstration that lasted a few days. The ringleaders of the small pro-militarist group took advantage of this administration bungling. They intimidated the workers. They still came to me with all sorts of threats and told me to dissolve the Federation. Think it over. Don't be a damn fool and be a white man's tool. They would tell me, we won't dissolve the Federation. I'd answer them, what the hell good is your citizenship in this concentration camp? As was expected, these people called a meeting. It was a rally in support of Japanese militarists and war financiers and emperor worship, with plenty of bonsai. The participants made wild charges of immoral behavior toward evacuees and misappropriation of funds by the Caucasian administrators. The camp administrators became excited when they heard about the meeting, and sent police officers to suppress it. After this, the small and rabid pro-Japanese militarist group held secret meetings at night in the apple orchard. Carl Yonda, the former longshoreman who was a member of the camp council, brought the matter of the pro-militarist meetings before the council. He denounced the secret meetings of these elements who eulogized the emperor and gave rousing bonsai to Japanese victories in the Pacific. He was told by the pro-militarist elements who packed a subsequent camp council meeting to retract his statement and apologize to them. He refused, and during all this time, the administration said nothing and aided the pro-militarists by their silence. Yonda stood his ground and, ironically, he seemed to be on trial. I remember that meeting, where Tamamasa Yamazaki, a man in his early 30s, with a keen mind and who perhaps was the most brilliant person on the council, supported his colleague on the council. Yamazaki spoke of the urgency of winning back constitutional rights, of defeating the anti-evacuee hysteria on the outside, and to plan for resettlement and to work closely with Caucasian committees being formed on the West Coast and elsewhere in our defense. He was practically alone among the intimidated councilors, but spoke in a clear voice and with proper perspective for the welfare of all, in supporting the stand taken by the former longshoreman. Yamazaki was an alien who had been brought to the United States when he was a child and educated here. Because of discriminatory laws against naturalization of Orientals, he remained an alien. His speech in that crowded camp council room, where intimidation and fear prevailed, was the most encouraging and challenging and impressive speech I ever heard behind the barbed wire confines of Manzanar. Yamazaki later volunteered for military service, and while on occupational duty in Japan, he died in an air crash. On numerous occasions during the war, I recalled his speech when I reviewed the bungling treatment of evacuees, particularly in the early period, when I saw the bitter renunciance of U.S. citizenship among evacuees preparing to go to the Chile Lake camp where they were segregated, when I saw the treatment of Japanese prisoners of war in U.S. Army camps on the Burma front. When I saw the atrocious treatment of Japanese POWs by Chiang Kai-shek's troops, when I was detailed to study the psychological warfare of the Chinese communist troops as an American army officer, and observe the treatment of Japanese POWs who were given better treatment than Chinese soldiers and rehabilitated and re-educated to rid them of militarist psychology. Manzanar Relocation Center, in the summer of 1942, had a Caucasian director who formerly had managed an Indian reservation. The mere fact that high government authorities chose such a man to run a camp for 10,000 people of Japanese ancestry was enlightening, and his conduct and attitude at Manzanar showed how terrible his administration of Indians must have been. There should be no Indian reservations in a democratic nation. The Indians had the land, and they were robbed and decimated. They should pursue life under conditions of freedom, but they are made paupers and wards of the government by profiteers who exercise strong influence in government. In a less brutal manner, the 110,000 evacuees of Japanese ancestry were put behind barbed wire. Indian reservations stood as examples and as precedent for impounding our people. Footnote. Ariyoshi continues, today, the evacuees are trying to collect their property losses caused by their removal, but the Justice Department and the administration stall payment, force compromises on claims, and make a farce of their limited promises. Just as conditions of Indian reservations influence treatment of evacuees to some extent, the awarding of evacuee claims would make Indians consider the claims due them. Hawaiians in like manner think of the great robbery when missionaries came with Bibles and took the land away. The descendants of missionaries live like fat cats, while numerous descendants of victimized Hawaiians live in abject poverty in slums, and seek homestead land without avail, because the powerful land monopolists here want to utilize the homestead land themselves. Honolulu Record, the 10th of January 1952, 1. Footnote end. This director had a very unsympathetic attitude toward us. Thus, the bungling of the camp administration, its bullying to make us accept policies even after they were found to be unpopular and wrong, all intensified the bitterness and anger among various evacuees. A small group of pro-Japanese militarist elements took advantage of this situation and tried to silence and paralyze through intimidation outspoken fighters for civil rights and improvements in camp. A few nights after the camp council meeting where Yonda had stood his ground under pressure, about 18 pro-militarist and bitter anti-American elements broke into his barracks room with sticks and clubs. The presence of his wife and the frightened screams of their son evidently prevented these men from beating him up. On the same night, another Nisei who had been educated in Japan was beaten up by a gang of hoodlums closely tied up with the handful of pro-militarist leaders. This Nisei was outspoken against Japanese military aggression. When I returned to my apartment late that night, I found a note on my straw-filled mattress from Carl. I was surprised by these incidents and rushed to his barracks. His wife was still quite shaken up and she objected to his going out, but we wanted to go to the hospital to see the Nisei who had been attacked. During this period of terrorism led by the small pro-Japanese militarist elements, it was said in camp that it was unsafe for many who fought for the restoration of civil rights and principles for which the Manzanar Citizens Federation stood to venture out at night. I served on the Judicial Committee of Manzanar in the summer of 1942. This was a trial court, and 3 of us evacuees and 2 Caucasian administrators, including the assistant camp director, were judges. We frequently exchanged opinions on camp affairs, and one day a Caucasian official who had attended our Manzanar Citizens Federation meetings said we should sit out the war quietly and not fight for civil rights. This official said that any such struggle would divide the residents because of the pro-militarist elements. I told this official we were not living in an Indian reservation and I advocate full constitutional rights for Indians, that we were not living in fascist Spain under Franco or in militarist Japan, and for the camp administration not to support our fight was tantamount to bowing before the West Coast racists. We had lively discussions at almost every meeting, before or after the court session. The assistant camp director and I often clashed in disagreement. I was opposed to bringing into Manzanar a steel cage used in old mining camp jails to lock up law violators. This small cage, with barely room enough for a man to stretch himself in, was brought into a padlocked barracks which was already a prison in itself. A prisoner put in there became a show thing, and thus it deprived human beings of decency. A young man was once brought into court for taking a piece of lumber, which was weather-beaten and lying on the ground for weeks. He wanted to make a table and stools, for our barracks were empty except for cots. Everything was government property anyway and we could take away nothing. When time for our release came, we would not want to take away with us any of the makeshift facilities. By a split vote, the young man was found guilty. Certainly the locking up of people in a cage in this modern time left deep scars in those who were thus abused. If we had forums and educational programs on democratic processes, training people to fight for constitutional rights and making them a reality for all, Manzanar would have developed the evacuees to struggle militantly for democratic rights and freedom. But the director from the Indian reservation and his assistant thought in terms of a steel cage to lock up people, in a padlocked barracks room which was, in turn, behind barbed wire and sentry watchtowers. One day a member of the Caucasian administrative staff who tried to make life more bearable for evacuees asked me to his apartment. There I met a solicitor from the National Office of the War Relocation Authority which had jurisdiction over Manzanar. The solicitor asked me, would you people live in peace if we improved your food, insulated your barracks with beaver board to keep out dust, and made conditions better all around? We had peace when we first arrived here, I said. We fought the wind and dust and cold together, but with the coming of stability we look to the fixture. Some of us struggle for civil rights. The great majority of us want to leave camp and resettle on the outside. I was extremely disappointed in this official, who practically told us to sit tight and wait for the war to end. About this time, the Federation called a meeting to discuss agricultural furlough work. I drafted a petition, asking the president to utilize us for farm work outside. About 800 Nisei and most of the Issei signed it. We circulated copies of this petition widely, and sent it to officials in Washington as well as to governors of western and mountain states. The response was surprisingly favorable, for manpower was short on the farms. We began organizing and orienting evacuees who wanted to leave for the sugar beet harvest, and before long the camp administration set up a labor council to help evacuee farm furlough workers. We objected because the council members chosen by the administration were inexperienced and unable to help evacuees who would go out to inland state farm areas. True enough, when fall came, evacuees who were recruited for Montana from Manzanar were exploited, intimidated, and treated inhumanly. I was in Idaho then, where we were well organized. They wrote us for suggestions and help. Some wrote that they were living in chicken coops and it was cold in Montana. I wrote to Larry Tajiri of the Pacific Citizen, suggesting that the Japanese American Citizens League investigate conditions in Montana and parts of Idaho from where I heard complaints. He wrote back that the JACL was considering such a project, and one evening Tajiri and his colleagues came to our camp in Idaho. They asked me to accompany two of them who were going to Montana, but I could not leave our area where we had several hundred evacuee farm workers. I still have the shocking reports the JACL investigators brought back from Montana. It is encouraging to read them now, for the struggle of the Nisei, Issei, and their supporters has made tremendous headway. When we left Manzanar Relocation Center to top sugar beets in the fall of 1942, unlike the volunteering during the spring, more of the men's wives accompanied us. Quite a number of the volunteers who had returned to the concentration camp after the spring sugar beet thinning had married, and I was one of them. Mrs. Margaret D.L., in charge of social work on the Manzanar Caucasian administrative staff, drove Tico and me to the nearby town of Lone Pine one day so that we could apply for a marriage license. We had a pass, and this was the first time that Tico breathed the refreshing air outside the barbed wire confinement since evacuating to Manzanar in April. The neon signs, restaurants, display of articles in stores, barber shops, and beauty parlors all looked attractive and inviting. And we laughed that the Hearst papers had propagandized and protested prior to our evacuation, which they had spearheaded to bring about, that we were going to be coddled at Manzanar with beauty parlors, manicurists, and swanky shops of various sorts. We asked Mrs. D.L. what else could the most vicious of the free press of the vested interests do. A few days after this trip outside, Mrs. D.L. went alone to pick up the license. She told us that the white officials of nearby towns had protested against Japs running around free. Tico and I had planned to be married by the Justice of the Peace at nearby Independence, but at the last minute our passes were revoked. We learned about this when we went to Margaret D.L.'s office to ride out to Independence. I arranged to have a Nazarene minister come in to perform the ceremony, she said apologetically. I hope you won't mind. After the ceremony, we were given a room in a honeymoon cottage for a period of 2 weeks. This was a tar paper barracks with bare rooms, for newlyweds. When the 2 weeks were up, they had to give up this privacy to occupy a 2 army cot space in crowded rooms. Family compartments in such rooms were marked off by white bed sheets hanging between beds from clotheslines strung between the rafters. During the day the sheets were pushed aside for airing the room. So as our group, including Tico, left for the sugar beet fields that fall from Manzanar, the womenfolk enjoyed the sight of the neat small towns. Some said they were looking ahead to a new life, with a feeling akin to that of their immigrant parents who had crossed the ocean to come to America. Practically everyone was economically ruined by the evacuation, and this was a new start. The young women from the West Coast cities went out into the fields and harvested potatoes with the men. In the late fall the frost came and then the snow, but by then we had harvested the sugar beet crop in our area. The farmers who earlier in the year had anticipated loss of their crop were happy. Some said we were good Japs while the more understanding said all people were alike. Some denounced their governor, who had said Japs breed like rats and were like rats a few days before we arrived in Idaho on our first trip in the spring. Now the governor was silent. The drunken sheriff who had threatened us with vigilante action and talked with his hand on his gun holster when we first arrived in Rupert was still tending his saloon, instructed by the city commissioners to stay out of our sight. Here, the people licked racist hysteria and we realized more strongly that the people have the power to do this everywhere. In face of opposition by racists and super patriots who feed from the palm of the vested interests that want to keep the people divided, and we learned to struggle by fighting for our rights. In Idaho, anti-Oriental racism was fortunately not deeply ingrained like Jim Crow in the South.